Oh, I think this is a little video, so I'm not sure about the volume. But you guys can see this online again. It's just on YouTube, and it's Southwest Virginia crop pollinators. And in addition to the slides and the photos we gather, I also have a whole bunch of pollinator links that I'll post and or email to you or post with the Living Web Farms. But this is our most diverse native bee group. It's Adreno Bee. They're mostly active in the spring. And then Osmia, the mason bees or orchard bees. And then our queen bees come out in the spring, and they're very fast. And there's the buzz pollination. We forgot to find a, did anyone do that? I need to return my, my thing. So there she's grabbing on and releasing even those little tiny sweat bees for the buzz pollination. Can you see? So she's collecting the pollen when she releases it. Yeah, right. And so then she's going to pack that onto her leg. And so bumblebees have corbicula like honeybees. There's a mason bee. She has black pollen-carrying hairs on her belly. This is an introduced species. She's got orange pollen-carrying hairs. And then this is a male. They have longer antennae. Sometimes it's more noticeable, so we call those longhorned bees. But all the males have a single piece, I forget what it's called, on their antenna longer. And there's one of the mining bees getting into the blueberries in spring. And so that's a carpenter bee robbing nectar, cutting a hole and getting the nectar out the side. Some research has found that they're still effective at pollinating. It jiggles it enough to help release pollen. And then those are the flowers, composite flowers, that makes it really efficient for a bee to visit a bunch of flowers quickly. And she's packing pollen into her corbicula on the back. So bumblebees and honeybees have special pollen baskets. And I think Brandon's probably going to talk about it. There's the small carpenter bee using the raspberry or the blackberry cane, just a little hole. And that's the small carpenter bee. They use existing cavities. And then there's one of our little sweat bees. And so we think that the squash bees and the bumblebees do most of the squash pollination in the morning. But about mid-morning, you'll still see lots of other diversity visiting. And that's one of our little halictid bees on a cucumber. So that's the cucumber. And this is actually a parasitic, a cuckoo bee that looks like a wasp. There's the little squash bee sitting on. He's got a little white patch, and those are honeybees down at the base of the female flower. So the bees, oftentimes it's just by accident they get pollen, and it's the pollen that they don't pack into their corbicula that when they land on the next flower that actually is effective in pollinating. And that's the female squash bee. They have really long tongues, and so they're collecting the nectar down there. And there's the males hanging out waiting for the females. They're about the same size as honeybees. But when you start observing your squash, you'll learn to recognize the squash bee from the honeybee. This is a leafcutter bee, right? Megachile bimaculatus, yeah. And that's a real common one in summer. So this is another bumblebee. In the late summer, the bumblebees, you can get up really close. The queens are much more wary in the spring. They're busy. And but the workers will hang out. And so there's the female. So they're collecting nectar from the base of the female. And there, just by accident, she's also collecting nectar at the base of the male flower. And it's just by accident that she's getting covered in the male pollen. And so she's not going to be able to get all of her hairs clean. So it's those ones that she misses. And when I did my research, I'd find sometimes a dozen or more bees in the squash. I think they got drunk. And this is the little tomatia bee. It's a specialist on physalis, which is our ground cherry. And so he did a capture and release study. Now he glues on little tiny QR codes instead of marking them. And that's the male bee. At the end of the season, they get kicked out of the hive. So, yeah. And there's the female squash bees. Usually that's all you see of the females. They're just their rumps sticking up out of the flowers. All right. So one of the other things Xerces now has is we have these citizen science monitoring guides. But this is kind of a neat chart. You can see their nesting habitat, what they're social or solitary, their tunnel nesting, ground nesting, or if they're nest parasites. And so it's kind of a neat way to look at them. And so it's a real simple guide. You can download it for free online. And it has the most common species. Then at the back it has that chart. And it has some diagrams to show the relative size as well. So it's a real handy guide. And then it has the bumblebees. So if you're interested in looking for the Bombus affinis, the rusty patch. And this is another little bee guide. Even though it says it's for apple orchards, it's a great little summary guide of the common groups. It shows the sizes, the relative sizes of the bees. It also lists some of the phenology and some plants that are good. And this is also neat because it talks about pesticides. And it has the common name, the product name, as well as the chemical name. And these will all be in the links that I include on the pollinator resource page. But if you go to our website, you can look for bee monitoring tools. The other ones, this is really the nicest one. So I'm just going to introduce in general, I talked about this a little bit, the solitary bees are single moms. But you guys can really help people learn that they don't have to be afraid of insects, because insects visiting flowers are not interested in stinging you. They're interested in collecting provisions. And if you start to observe wasps in the garden, you'll see that they're very systematically going through the plant looking for little tiny insects or caterpillars or aphids. And they're very systematic about it. It's really fun once you start to look to see that. So here's that wasp deterrent lantern I was talking about. We put it in the shed, but we had birds nesting. They didn't mind that. So here's the, this is a little tiny wasp that we get. But we also get the mud daubers, and I don't have a picture of the mud dauber, but look who's over here. So that's a parasitic wasp. She's looking for bees and wasps to lay her eggs in. And I don't know if Brandon's going to talk about this too much, but after a couple years, if you have the kind of nest that he has around, or if you have these, or there's some really cool observation hives, you'll see that they get filled with mites, and they could actually become sinks for bees and wasps. So if you start to notice a lot of little critters in there, then it's really important to clean those out or put fresh ones out. So, and then maybe go ahead and let the first group of them rot away. Put them in some place where they'll actually get rained on and rotten, and put out fresh things every couple years. Or even every year, just put a new bunch out. And so we have a lot of native bees that are pollen specialists, besides that tomatillo bee. So I'm just going to highlight a few of those, and he's going to go into much more detail about bees. But there's this jaredfowler.com specialist bees. I tried to go to the Illinois Wildflowers and I had a hard time using that site. But when I went to prepare for this talk, and I looked at Jared's, he's missing a lot of our Southeast bee specialists. So we need to really update that. But these are some of the common things that have specialist bees, like thistles and golden aster and squash. Sunflowers have a huge group of specialist bees. They get visited by lots and lots of different bees, but those bees only eat pollen from the sunflower family. So when we talk about specialist bees versus specialist butterflies, like host plants for butterflies, the caterpillar eats the whole plant. But when we talk about specialists for bees, it means they only eat pollen from either that family or that genus of plants. But then they might collect nectar from lots of different species. So about 70% of our bees are ground nesting. A lot of people have these anthophorid bees in the spring. About right now, you might see them under like a eave of a barn. And then those are the little andrenid bees, and we also have Calides. And so here they dig a cavity in the ground, and it could be 2 or 3 feet. I understand out west it might be 12 or 13 feet in the ground. And then they line it with a little bit of a secretion. On some bees, that's a really noticeable secretion, and so they're called polyester bees. So I have a little video. This is not the best, because this one I have to play it multiple times for you to be able to see it. But what happens is she gets water, and she moistens the mud, and then she brings it up, and then she shoots it out of the nest. So that's what all these little balls are. So she's gone down. So it's kind of fun to see. And whenever the hibiscus are in flower, the rose mallow, then you'll see them. They'll also visit roses of Sharon, or if you're on the coast, the Kosteletskaya, and also okra and cotton. Those are they all are in the hibiscus family. And so tunnel nesting bees, we've kind of seen some of those. So just providing pithy stemmed plants is really helpful. And so here's the eggs. So they gather the nectar and pollen. And this one I really do want you to see. This was from Phyllis Stiles. Oh, there it goes. So she calls this Michaela Phelps. And you can see, and I learned from Kim Bailey, who's been really watching. See how she's unloading the pollen? So it's actually, when she first goes in, she packs the pollen from the front. And she takes off any pollen that's in the front part of her body. But then she flips over and takes the pollen off. And then when she comes back, she'll pack the pollen that she brought in, that she unloaded just then. And so, yeah. So here you can see the mud that she's gathered. And this particular one, she doesn't seem to add a whole lot of nectar. So it's a kind of a dry pollen. But that's an observation hive. So see, that has a little door that closes. So it's a really fun thing to do. There's different sizes of holes. But you can also take it apart and clean it out after a couple years. I have trouble with earwigs. So if I leave it sitting on a table or something, the earwigs will come and will eat the larvae. So what I have to do is hang it with like a hummingbird feeder thing. You know how you can get a guard for ants for a hummingbird feeder. So that's what I do. I hang it down so that the earwigs can't access it. All right, and there's the, you can go online and see lots of the specialist bee. It's called Telos bombiformis. And it looks just like a bumblebee. But when you see the bees visiting the rose mallow, then chances are it's the Telothrix. If you were able to get a close-up picture, you could compare the back leg of this bee to a bumblebee, because only bumblebees and honeybees have that special pollen-carrying basket. These guys would pack pollen across their legs, like kind of so. And there's the little specialist bee that Pat was so excited about, the Tomatia bee. And it's called Colides latatarsis. And I understand that there's lots of pollen specialists in that group, and they're active in early spring mostly as well. But here's what the larvae look like before they go in. And this one, all of these ground nesting bees line their cells, but the cellophane bee, it's particularly noticeable. And so they call it the polyester or plaster bee. And here's the little Tomatia flower. So there's the squash bee. And we do have some native wild cucumbers. I think one of these is burr cucumber and one is just called wild cucumber. And but like melon and cucumbers and watermelon, those are actually Western from the old world. Those are old world crops, but they still get visited by these bees. But the squash bees actually moved north with squash and pumpkin that were brought from Central and South America with Native Americans. And then there's a huge diversity of sunflower bees. You'll see these ones, they often are sunflower bees. Eucera and Sevastra have really thick, my colleague Jennifer calls them chaps. It looks like their legs are just covered in pollen, and they're just really big, hefty back legs. And then here's a leafcutter bee. She's got pollen all over her rear end. And this one is called Megachilus, the leafcutter group, and then Xylocopa is actually the scientific name for carpenter bee. And so this one is called a carpenter bee mimic leafcutter bee. And so, but she's a specialist on sunflowers. So here she's visiting the mountain mint. She's collecting nectar, but she probably, all of this pollen is probably from a sunflower. And this one, is really unusual. It's an Adreno bee. Most of our Adreno bees come out in early spring, but this one is a sunflower specialist. And our native sunflowers bloom about now through the fall. So this one only comes out in late summer. And then the Southeastern Blueberry Bee, again, it looks just like a bumblebee. And whenever I take pictures, I can't tell based on the picture. But when you see it flying, like our squash bee, once you start observing it, you can see they fly a little bit differently. They're a little smaller than our bumblebees in early spring. And they just have a different way of moving around. And then the males have a yellow patch. So about this time of year, we have another bee that looks really similar that has a yellow patch as well. That's an anthophorid bee. But if it's early spring and you see that white patch, then chances are that's the Southeastern Blueberry Bee. And so it visits. We have a huge diversity of native blueberries and huckleberries and cranberries. And sourwood. But, they'd be too late for the sourwood because that's blooming now. And then the morning glory family. So there's a couple specialists, the Cimolobus ipomea, and I've never seen that one, I don't think. The one I see is this one, and I'm always trying to get pictures of it. But this is our native morning glory. It's called Ipomea pandurata, and I think this is it too, even though it doesn't have the burgundy center. We have a lot of field bindweed that looks similar, but our native one isn't aggressive like the field bindweed. You'll see it along roadsides sometimes, and it's never a weedy problem. But this is a really cool plant. It's called manroot, man of the earth, wild potato, wild rhubarb. So our forager over there might have some more information about that plant for us during the break. And then another specialist are on the peas. And the peas are actually very hard to get into. And so the bee has to be pretty forceful to push down that keel on the flower. And out west, the alfalfa bee is really important for pollinating peas. We don't grow alfalfa for seed here, but we do have those bees. But these are also leafcutter bees. Can you see the pollen-carrying hairs on her belly? Those are called scopa. And so leaf cutters and mason bees carry pollen on their belly instead of on their legs.
And an interesting fact, just really quick about the alfalfa bee, is it was actually very difficult to find a pollinator for alfalfa in the States because the mechanism for alfalfa is when it's tripped, it actually smacks, it has a mechanism that smacks the pollinator right in the head. And that it deterred a lot of pollinators. A lot of people just didn't want that smack. But actually, the alfalfa bee doesn't mind at all. They're one of the few insects that can really take that slap and keep going. So that's really one of the reasons why they're so effective at pollinating that.
So that's actually an introduced bee that came in from Europe, because the alfalfa also came from Europe. But we do have an alkali bee that also is really good at pollinating alfalfa. And so they've actually figured out, it's actually a ground nesting bee. It's one of the few ground nesters that we figured out how to kind of create a nesting habitat for it. So in alfalfa, and people actually make a living with one of our native ground nesters, the alfalfa bee. And then this one is really cool, and this is our native passion vine. So this happens to be an introduced one, but it looks just like our native purple passion vine. And carpenter bees aren't listed as a specialist, but carpenter bees and bumblebees fit perfectly. They actually have little pollen sacs there. But in Mexico, where they raise maypops and the passion flowers to sell for production, they actually provide nesting boxes, blocks of wood for carpenter bees to help increase production. And but this one is just a specialist on our little native, it's a little tiny yellow. Do you have these? Yeah, so it's a little woodland passion flower. And if you have it, then that means you have these little passion flower bees as well.
Yeah, we definitely have the passion flower. I thought you meant we have the bees, and I think I've seen the bees too.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah. Okay, so that's I wanted to include some information on the specialists. And so butterflies also have specialist relationship. Of course, it's for the whole plant. But here's another one of those stories where the main herbivore on yucca happens to be the yucca moth caterpillar. And the main pollinator for the yucca moth flower is the yucca moth. So if we got rid of the main pest on yucca, we would lose the yucca because it depends on the adult for pollination. You can see they have evolved together because the adult moth blends into the flower parts. It looks just like the flower part.
And so Nancy, I would bet that there's also a parasitoid that feeds on the yucca and lays its eggs in the larva.
You're right, because I've collected the seed and I saw there was a little larva, so I took it home and I put it in my little plastic with a few holes in it, and I never did see a butterfly, but I did find a beautiful little braconid wasp who had laid her eggs.
Wasp feeds on that same pollen. Those relationships are all completely specialized and perfect. It all works. You know, there's the right number of herbivores, there's the right number of parasitoids, and the yucca is doing fine.
Yep. So here's another butterfly that I think is really cool, the zebra swallowtail. And I don't know if you can see how tiny the leaves are. But she doesn't have anywhere else to lay her eggs because her young need pawpaw to lay on. There's only ½ an inch of leaf, but she's anticipating that there's going to be enough growth for her young to come out. And this is what the caterpillar looks like. And if you've never tried the fruit, it's really fantastic. It's like creme caramel. And this is pollinated by flies, which, you know, are underappreciated pollinators, I think. So, and then when we talk about disturbance, if you are particularly interested in a butterfly species, it is good to understand where they're nesting, because they could be a little bit more sensitive to fire. And but even if they get disturbed that first season when you introduce fire, chances are for the next 5 or 10 years they're going to benefit from that rejuvenation that the fire provides in terms of diversity. And so we have a bunch of information about how to support habitat for bees. It's mainly that you want to have flowers for the growing season. Oftentimes when we talk about pollinator habitat now, people think meadows. But if you're a beekeeper, you know how important our trees and shrubs are in the early spring. But also at this time of year, around here, sourwood, of course, is in flower. A lot of our riparian areas are vital because, you know, this year we're having plenty of rain. But if we weren't, it would mainly be the riparian corridors that have the flowering habitat. And then in fall, this is buttonbush, wonderful, wonderful plant. And so the plants you choose are really making a difference. And you never know, you might be planting the next angel oak. How many of you have visited the angel oak down? Yeah, so it's worth a trip down to Charleston and St. John's Island just to see that. So Doug Tellamy has a ton of information on his bringingnatureHome.net. He lists all the plants on his research. But white oak is the one that, this happens to be a live oak. But white oak is the one that he found up in Delaware, had the greatest diversity. So Xerces has a bunch of information about pesticides on our website, and all of our materials are free except for, we have 2 books. One of them's called Attracting Native Pollinators, and we'll figure out, we'll be giving away all these books later today. But everything else that we have is free to download online. And so we did initially the kind of a literature review of the neonicotinoids. I think it came out in 2008. And then we updated it with this orange one, but we found that there was now so much research going on that we just have a kind of an ongoing updated literature review online. So you can kind of go there and check to see what the latest information is. And then we just were so lucky to have Bee City join with us. And many of you probably know Phyllis Stiles of Bee City USA. She started it. And so this is the Bee City, she's just a wonderful, creative person. And so it really, what it does is just help raise awareness in your community. So it usually just publicizes things that are already happening that are good for pollinators and helps raise awareness. And most people want to do something to help pollinators right now. So it's a really great program. So here's the beetle bank, just simply leaving an unmowed strip. This happens to be little bluestem, one of our smaller stature native grasses, and leaving overwintering sites. Native diverse hedgerows, this is a California one. This is one that Van Burnett put in at his farm. He's in Black Mountain. He runs the Hoppin' Blueberry farm. And so he got really small plants. If you're planting shrubs, you can actually get sometimes from, especially a wetland nursery, plants for $2 or $5 that are really small, but plants like that, if they go in the ground, they're less, you need to worry less about watering them if they're small, and they take over the larger size plants within a couple years. And so what he did, I have a community garden, that's where a lot of my seeds that I brought came from, and I told him that, oh, I have all these plants, you're welcome to, and so he planted a lot of perennials in between his shrubs, so while his shrubs were growing, he still had lots of perennials, and then once his shrubs get bigger, he can move those to other parts of his yard if he'd like to. But so these are providing beneficial habitat. And so he used some shrubby St. John's wort, and this is a native honeysuckle, the Dyerbilla. It's really only an upland species, so it grows where I live, but it's found naturally in this region, in the mountains. And he used buttonbush and I think he used about 6 different species, so he'd always have something in flower through the growing season. And then I really like to emphasize riparian areas, especially as we're seeing urban growth. And in North Carolina, and I think it's probably true in Virginia and South Carolina as well, but the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission has a whole growing green toolbox for helping to keep riparian areas. But you know, in the past, we used to put streams and things into culverts. But as we're growing and we're starting to really appreciate how important green areas are for our own health, this is the perfect place to protect habitat, to help keep our water clean, to have things in flower during the summer months, and so it's a really great thing. But of course, birds depend on the insect life. That's why they're there, because of the insects. And these guys, even though they're eating the bigger birds, they're depending on the insects that the smaller birds eat to feed their young. And this is some work done at Virginia Tech where she was trying to provide information about creating stream buffers that also provided added income for farmers. So she was promoting things like our native hazelnut. How many of you have ever seen the hazelnut? Oh, it's just the most beautiful seed head. So, and then she also promoted things like our winterberry holly, so you could sell the cut stems, and some other things like the shrub dogwood that you would have multiple purposes and also provide habitat. Now these documents, this is from the National Agroforestry Center, and I brought those, and you guys are welcome. I brought all the things that don't have display written on them. You're welcome to help yourself in the back there. But these ones you can order for free. They're from the National Agroforestry Center, and I'll include links in the pollinator links that I send out. But they're really nice if you're going to do a presentation somewhere. You can order those and share those. This one's all about habitat for wildlife, but that benefits pollinators too. And there's the sumac. It's a great super plant that it also has pithy stems, habitat for lots of different, and some of the other things that we already mentioned. Box elder's another one, yeah. So, and then leaving grasses is really important. Bumblebees particularly like habitat that mice would have been in, and the grasses tend to fall over, so it keeps its shelter from predators, and it's also a place to move around below the ground. And then a diversity through the growing season. There's a huge diversity of wildflowers. People often ask me for wildflower lists, and we have them, and they'll be in the things I give out, but I always encourage people to figure out which nursery you're going to be using and get the list of availability that they have, and so that you'll be able to make a list from what you'll actually be able to get for your garden. And then we have a huge diversity of native milkweeds, and we've seen about an 80% decline in monarch butterflies since 2000. And that's when they introduced these what are called Roundup Ready crops. And so in fields of corn and soybean and rice, and I think there's 2 more crops. No, I forget what the others are. But in any case, now they can spray their crops for weeds. And so areas that used to be kind of edge habitat where the milkweed grew have disappeared as well. And we think that's why we're seeing such declines. And then also imidacloprid, some of the neonics. And I'm not talking about that too much today, but you've probably heard about the neonics, and they can actually move through the soil. And some of our home use of that is actually worse than some of the agricultural use because of the way they have to convert the recommended application from an agricultural field to home use. So cover crops can be really great as long as they're not invasive plants. And we saw a lot of those today, especially the buckwheat. And just leaving some weeds can be great for your prey, for your other predators and parasitoids. And Pat talked about some of the extrafloral nectaries. Have you ever seen wasps or ants on the base of your nice beans? That's because they're actually purposely attracting predators to come help prey on the pests. So, and since we were talking about slowing down to see, oftentimes we think of the host plants for butterflies, but they often will move off of their host plant to go to other plants. And I just thought this was so cool. The pipevine goes onto this river birch, and it just blended in so beautifully. It just seemed like it must be have evolved over time because it was successful because no bird could find it. Does that make sense? Can you guys see them? There's the chrysalis. Very hard to see. And this is its host plant, and that's the caterpillar. It's very hard to capture how beautiful they are. They're like chocolate velvet with bright red spots on them. And then these are kind of commercially made, to sort of handmade signs. But I think if you can get your kids to help make signs or your grandkids, it just makes it even more engaging. It helps start a conversation with your neighbor. And this was a project down in Birmingham. They asked artists to help them make different bee habitats. And maybe not all of their hotels were, perfect or super effective, but they made it really fun to go visit and see who was visiting. And it was a really engaging way to help people think about habitat. And there's lots of great resources online. This is a Nectar Source. You can sort by the season or whether it's native or lots of different things. And the same thing for pollen. And you can see the different colors. And so, yeah. And then iNaturalist. So this is a really cool thing. This was Ann Walter Fromson. She took the native plant certificate program at the NC Botanic Garden. And so for her project, she worked with Ann Lindsay to just monitor who was visiting the flowers in her backyard. All of her pictures were taken with the iPhone. And she started posting online to the iNaturalist to help with identification. And so if you want to do that, so she created her own project, but you can just post without having a project, or there might be a project for a local park you could add to their data set. But it's a really amazing tool. Then Bumblebee Watch, we also have a program, that's a Xerces program. But I understand if you post to iNaturalist, it will feed into Bumblebee Watch. And then Bug Guide is another one. So the way iNaturalist works is it's not necessarily specialists or anybody who has recognition as being able to recognize. And so you kind of come to a consensus. And if there's enough consensus, then that gets recognized as an official identification. The way it works in Bug Guide is there's actually people that are specialists. And so they've kind of been vetted. They might not be they might be, a lot of our naturalists are just specialists from their own work, and they become recognized over time. And so sometimes it might take a little bit longer, but it's another way. But when I'm doing identification, I often just describe something in Google and look at the images, and then I try to find one of the bug guide pictures, a photo that came from bug guide, and if you pull it up, I think I have another picture. Oops, no. So if you pull up the species, if you pull up that picture, it'll show it to the particular species, and you can move back up this chain. So I don't know if you guys can see that, but this says ants, bees, wasps. This is the order Hymenoptera. But if I had a particular species, it'll have a little more detail, like the genus or the species. And then I could move back up to see more general categories. I think I wanted to show you this because sometimes people don't realize that if you scroll down, there's often more information as you move down the page. It's not apparent when you first look at the site.
Could you do a little exercise and actually, I guess we're not online, so you couldn't do it.
Yeah.
But could you just describe a bug we all know, so we know what you mean by describe it for group?
Yeah, so suppose I took a picture, like we saw a bug yesterday, and I would recognize it probably as a bug, as a true bug versus a beetle. But maybe one time somebody was asking me about a very large orange and black wasp. So I just put in orange and black wasp, and they had sent me a picture. So I pulled up the images for that, and then I found the closest one to that, and I was able to go back into Bug Guide. But nowadays,
very basic description.
Right. And sometimes it's really important, depending on the kind of critter, you might want to put the plant you found it on. So when I worked with extension, somebody brought in a catawba moth, and I didn't know about the catawba caterpillar. They brought in the caterpillar. They talked about this pest on their catawba, and I put in caterpillar and catawba, and of course it brought it up instantly. So yeah. So these are some books that are really great. If you haven't seen this one, it's a really extraordinary book for the Southern Appalachians. It's called Wildflowers and Plant Communities of the Southern Appalachian Highlands, I think, and Piedmont, yeah. But it's by Tim Spira. He used to be at Clemson, and he groups things in ecoregions. So he has mountain balds and riparian forest, I forget. They're not huge, so it's kind of intimidating to read the whole thing at once, but when you visit a certain place, you can read that section, and he talks about the most common plants there and pollinators. He came from pollination from the plant side rather than the bee side. And then there's cover crop information in the back of this. I brought copies of this one, and I think I'm almost done. So then NRCS has a ton of information. If you're interested in that, I can tell you how to contact folks. And Xerces, we've got a lot, and we have a whole pollinator resource center. And then there's a whole bunch of ways you can learn more about native plants. Around here, there's the Arboretum. Yeah, and the Bot Garden. And then Bee City and Bee Campus USA. And so just remember that critters need shelter. They need a place for their eggs and refuge and overwintering sites. So leaving some messy areas over winter is really important too. And they need nectar and pollen and caterpillar host plants and specialist bee host plants. And they need protection, but if you can introduce prescribed fire, that usually is actually a benefit, or thinning a forest can actually be good.
What is overwintering sites?
Yeah, okay. So that varies a lot, and that's one of those tricky things if you're in a garden. If you have, a lot of times for some of our stink bugs, they'll say, make sure you clean up all the leaf debris. But then if you go back and if you do look up this book, you'll see it'll talk about where they overwinter. And often it's under leaves or in the plant debris. So if you get rid of all that stuff, you're also taking the shelter from the predators and parasitoids. So it's that balancing act. When we see all those harlequin bugs in the spring underneath that piece of wood, it's hard not to want to get rid of all that stuff. So yeah.
Is it possible because of crop rotation and stuff, is it possible to just take some of that material and just go throw it off to the side?
Yes, just leaving a pile is great for lots of things, yeah. And yeah.
And for general mix of them, two plants that are really good to allow to be as residue are comfrey and yarrow. They kind of die in layers, and so they provide a lot of habitat. And basically, the reason that I sometimes don't want to do it is not so much the insects, I trust the balance, but the diseases. Like, let's say, broccoli overwintering will have a lot of its complex of pests and predators.
Okay.
But it also has the disease.
Right.
And so it's a balance, but in general, it's usually worth it. You just, the solutions to disease are more about nutrition and, good airflow and enough sun, and less about keeping the organisms out. The organisms are all around anyways.
But if you do have disease things, you could compost those more rigorously and put the things that aren't diseased into the debris pile.
Yeah, but what's hard with the brassicas is that the complex is most common. Both the predators and the prey are on the plants. And so if those residues are there, you usually get a jump start. So you got to play with it.
Okay. So this is just the last thing that sometimes we forget that butterflies are pollinators too, but can you see all the pollen on her wings? And yeah, so thank you.